All right, names and IDs right now.
We can show our employee IDs on our phones and call our supervisor. You can verify in 2
No,
minutes.
I said IDs, not your
We're
phone.
right outside our workplace. What specific issue are you investigating?
I got a complaint and you look suspicious. That's enough.
A complaint about what
So
crime?
you're refusing.
This was the kind of stop that only existed because an officer decided it should. In a parking lot outside a work site in Pennsylvania, Officer Whitlock stood in front of a small group of workers and kept demanding names and identification. She said they looked suspicious and claimed one of them didn't have an ID badge visible. The workers stayed calm and tried to solve it quickly. They offered to show their employee IDs on their phones and offered their supervisors contact info, so the officer could confirm they belonged there. Whitlock refused what they offered. She talked over them and repeated the same demand for names and ID, like the only acceptable outcome was full compliance on her terms. Quick pause. Comment where you're watching from. State or country. And if you like stories where, calm facts, recording, and oversight beat bad policing, hit like and subscribe. Now here's how it started. It was a normal shift window near a large industrial site. Not a quiet back road, not a high crime scene. Just a workplace area with employee parking, a sidewalk leading toward the building, and people moving in and out around break time. Most workers had badges on lanyards or clipped to their shirts, but the site also used phone-based employee ID screens because not everyone kept a plastic badge visible every second. Frank Coleman was with 2 coworkers, Maya Singh and Luis Ramirez. They had just walked out of the building area toward the lot. They weren't running, they weren't hiding, they weren't bothering anyone. They were doing what workers do every day, moving between their cars, the entrance, and the break area. Officer Whitlock rolled up and approached like she had already decided there was a problem. She told them there had been a complaint about suspicious people near the site. She focused on one detail and tried to make it the whole justification. She claimed one of them didn't have a badge visible. Luis immediately tried to make it easy. He offered to pull up his employee ID on his phone and offered to call their supervisor so the officer could verify the shift in names. Maya backed that up and pointed out they were right outside their workplace during a normal shift window. Whitlock ignored the verification they offered and repeated that she needed their names and physical ID. She treated the phone IDs like they didn't count and treated the supervisor contact like a delay tactic. She kept the conversation one way, like the goal wasn't to confirm anything. It was to collect information. The workers didn't raise their voices. They didn't insult her. They didn't step toward her. They stayed where they were and kept their hands visible. They repeated their offer to verify employment and asked what specific issue she was investigating. Whitlock kept saying she had a complaint and kept leaning on the word suspicious. The problem was she still didn't connect it to a specific suspected crime. She didn't describe a theft report, trespass report, assault report, or anything concrete. She just kept acting like the complaint itself gave her authority to demand whatever she wanted. Frank recognized where it was going. He didn't argue in circles. He challenged it calmly and stayed focused on one point. Pennsylvania didn't have a general rule that let police force someone to identify themselves just because an officer asked. He explained that without a lawful reason tied to a specific suspected crime, she couldn't demand names and ID like it was mandatory. Whitlock didn't respond by stating a crime. She responded by pushing harder. She talked over him and tried to frame his explanation as refusal. She treated calm legal knowledge like disrespect. That's when the power game became obvious. Whitlock wasn't trying to confirm whether they were employees. She had been offered a clean, easy confirmation twice. She wanted control of the interaction, and she wanted names, because names let her run checks and build a record. Frank and the others weren't trying to win an argument. They were trying to keep it lawful and keep it calm, while also not giving up rights just to end an uncomfortable moment. Maya quietly did the smart thing people do now. She started recording on her phone without announcing it, not to provoke, not to go viral, just to keep the exact words and timing from getting rewritten later. Whitlock noticed the phones. She didn't like it, Her tone sharpened. She repeated the demand for names again, louder, and she stepped closer like she was trying to make backing down feel impossible. Luis tried once more to de-escalate by offering the supervisor number. He told Whitlock she could call right then and get confirmation. Whitlock refused again and kept insisting on ID first. At that point, the stop wasn't moving toward resolution. It was moving toward escalation without a clear legal foundation. And the next thing Whitlock did was what forced the situation into a higher level. She called for a supervisor and started acting like the workers were the problem for not handing over information they didn't legally have to give. Whitlock tried to turn a simple workplace check into a detention without saying the word detention. She stepped closer and repeated the demand for names and ID, faster and louder, talking over the workers whenever they tried to answer. She kept pointing to the missing visible badge like it proved wrongdoing, even though the workers kept offering the same easy verification: phone employee IDs and a supervisor call. Frank stayed calm and did not match her tone. He kept the conversation on one track. He told her they were willing to confirm employment, but she still needed a lawful reason tied to a specific suspected crime before forcing identification. He asked her what crime she was investigating. Whitlock went back to the same line about a complaint. She still did not state what crime was suspected. She did not say that there was a theft report, trespass report, or any specific victim complaint. She used the complaint as a shield so she could keep demanding ID. Maya kept recording. She didn't step forward. She didn't narrate. She just held the phone low and steady so the audio caught Whitlock talking over them and refusing their verification options. Luis tried one more time to end it clean. He offered to call their shift supervisor on speaker right there. He offered to show the supervisor's text thread in the schedule. Whitlock refused again and told him she needed government ID and names first. She treated everything the workers offered as not good enough, even though it would have answered her stated concern immediately. That's the part that mattered. She wasn't acting like someone trying to confirm who they were. She was acting like someone trying to take control and collect information. Whitlock then tried to box them in by making it sound like they were required to comply. She said they had to give names because she asked. She talked like refusal would become a problem by itself. Frank didn't argue back and forth. He stayed respectful and kept repeating the legal point. Pennsylvania did not have a general stop and identify requirement for people who were not suspected of a specific crime, and a vague complaint wasn't enough by itself. Whitlock responded by shifting the pressure onto him. She framed his explanation as refusing and tried to make it sound like he was being difficult. She attempted to create a new justification out of his calm pushback. Then she made the move officers make when they want leverage without having a charge. She told them to stay where they were while she checked things out. She started using hold-on language and positioning herself to keep them from walking away, while still not stating an actual legal reason for detention. Maya's recording captured that shift, and it was clear why it mattered. A casual contact is optional. A detention isn't. Whitlock was sliding it into a detention without saying the legal reason out loud. Luis asked again what crime was being investigated. Whitlock repeated the complaint line and pointed again to the badge issue. She still didn't connect it to a specific offense. Frank kept his voice steady. He told her they were not trying to obstruct anything. They were offering verification, but they were not going to hand over personal ID just because she demanded it without stating a lawful basis. Whitlock got more irritated, and instead of accepting the supervisor call, she finally called for her own supervisor. She did it like she expected backup to force compliance. While they waited, the workers stayed put to avoid giving her an excuse to claim they fled. They kept hands visible. They kept recording. They kept offering the same verification options. Whitlock kept refusing. A few minutes later, a patrol supervisor arrived. He didn't come in yelling. He came in trying to understand what he was walking into. Whitlock immediately tried to frame it as a simple situation, where workers were refusing to identify themselves. She leaned hard on the missing visible badge and the complaint. She talked like that automatically justified ID demands. The supervisor asked the basic question Whitlock hadn't answered. What specific suspected crime was being investigated? Whitlock didn't give a clean answer. She stayed vague and repeated the same points. The supervisor then turned to the workers. Frank and Luis explained they were employees, offered to show phone IDs and contact their shift supervisor, and explained their understanding of the law. Without a lawful reason tied to a specific suspected crime, they did not have to provide government ID or names on demand. The supervisor looked at the situation and made the practical call. He accepted the verification route Whitlock had refused. He allowed the workers to show employee IDs on their phones and allowed the supervisor contact to confirm they belonged there. Once that happened, the entire suspicious claim collapsed in real time. With confirmation available and no specific crime stated, there was no reason to keep pushing names and ID like it was mandatory. The supervisor told Whitlock to end the stop. Whitlock backed off, unhappy, but she couldn't keep it going without creating an even clearer violation on camera. The workers walked away without incident. And now they had a recording of the entire thing. Whitlock's repeated demands, her refusal to accept reasonable verification, her inability to state a specific suspected crime. And the moment a supervisor stepped in and agreed the workers didn't have to provide ID in that situation. The workers didn't treat it like a bad vibe and move on. They treated it like a documented incident. Right after the stop, Frank and Maya wrote down what mattered while it was fresh. The time, location, Whitlock's name and badge number, and the key problem. She demanded names and ID without stating a specific suspected crime, refused reasonable verification, and escalated by trying to hold them there. Luis contacted their shift supervisor, Tom Heller, and told him what happened. Heller already knew the basics because the police supervisor had accepted the workplace verification and ended the stop. Now Heller went one step further. He emailed site security and asked them to preserve any exterior camera footage from the time window. He also requested any gate logs or employee access records that showed the workers were where they were supposed to be. The workers filed a complaint with the police department. They kept it clean and specific about what happened. They also included something that usually changes how a complaint is handled. They disclosed that the entire interaction was recorded on a phone and that the worksite likely had security footage. They didn't threaten. They just made it clear the facts could be verified. That forced the department to pull Whitlock's body camera. When Internal Affairs reviewed the footage, it showed the same problem the workers described. The stop started with suspicion based on appearance and a badge visibility claim. Whitlock demanded names and ID, talked over their verification offers, and kept leaning on a complaint without connecting it to a specific suspected crime. When the workers stayed calm and explained the legal limit, she responded by escalating tone and pressure instead of stating lawful grounds. The department also reviewed the supervisor's body cam. That footage mattered because it showed the correction happening on scene. The supervisor accepted the workplace verification route and ended the ID demand, confirming the workers' point that this was not a situation where forced identification was required. Then the department asked for outside footage. The worksite provided exterior video showing the workers walking normally in an employee area during a normal shift window. It did not support any claim that they were trespassing, hiding, or acting like suspects. It also supported the workers' statement that Whitlock chose them first and built reasons after. Once investigators had all three pieces, phone recording, Whitlock's body cam, and security footage, the complaint stopped being about attitude and became about procedure. Internal Affairs did what they always do next. They checked whether this was a one-time mistake or a pattern. They pulled Whitlock's recent stops and body cam clips for the same markers. Vague, suspicious reasoning lash ID demands without stating a specific suspected crime. Refusal to accept reasonable verification. Escalations framed as non-compliance. talking over people instead of explaining lawful basis. They also checked her reports for the same wording patterns and whether her written narratives matched video. The pattern was consistent enough that the department couldn't treat it as a single misunderstanding. It looked like a habit. She treated compliance as proof of innocence and treated refusal as a reason to escalate, even when the law didn't support forcing ID. That's what made the review move fast. Not because of social media, not because the workers were famous, because the evidence was clear and the behavior repeated. By the time Whitlock was interviewed internally, she couldn't rely on the usual defenses. The recording showed she had been offered verification and rejected it. The supervisor's footage showed the stop had no solid footing, and the review of prior incidents suggested this wasn't new. Within weeks, the department made a decision. They terminated Officer Whitlock for how she handled the stop, escalating without articulating a specific suspected crime, refusing reasonable verification, and creating an unlawful pressure situation that a supervisor had to correct on scene. And that firing wasn't the end of it for the workers. Because once the department admits an officer's conduct was improper on a recorded stop, other people who had similar encounters start coming forward, and the department has to answer whether it ignored those earlier, too. After Whitlock was terminated, the department tried to keep it quiet at first, but the workers' complaint had recordings, a supervisor correction on Bodycam, and outside security footage. That combination doesn't stay internal for long. Frank and the others didn't go looking for attention. They just wanted the record to be accurate and the conduct addressed. What surprised them was how many people started reaching out once word got around at the site. Other workers mentioned similar stops in the same area, being questioned for no clear reason, being asked for names, being treated like they had to prove they belonged. Some people said they complied just to end it. Some said they didn't complain because they assumed nothing would happen. Now something had happened. The department's leadership had to answer a simple question internally. If a supervisor on scene acknowledged the stop had no solid legal basis, why did it take a formal complaint and a full review to stop this type of approach from repeating? So the department did what it usually does after an officer gets fired for a recorded stop. It tightened procedures and tried to reduce exposure. They pushed changes that were practical and easy to enforce. Officers had to clearly state the reason for a stop tied to a specific suspected crime when demanding identification. Training was updated to make the difference clear between a voluntary contact and a detention, especially in workplace and public settings. Report writing rules were tightened, so officers couldn't write vague narratives that didn't match video. The worksite also made changes, not because the workers had done anything wrong, but because they didn't want random patrol stops becoming a regular risk. For the workers, the main impact was simple. They learned that staying calm and documenting the right details matters more than trying to win in the moment. Frank talked about it later like this. Whitlock had been offered multiple ways to confirm they were employees. She refused those options because she wanted control, not confirmation. The supervisor ended it because there was no legal foundation to keep it going. Maya kept her recording saved even after the firing because she understood something important. The system changes only when people can show exactly what happened, in order without exaggeration. Louise said the biggest lesson was that the moment you start talking over someone and ignoring verification, you're not investigating anymore. You're just trying to force submission. The story ended with a clear result. The officer lost her job because she escalated without articulating a specific suspected crime and refused reasonable verification while treating compliance like proof of innocence. And the bigger point was what the supervisor proved on scene. If the law doesn't give an officer authority to force identification, the officer doesn't get to create that authority by being louder. Now, I want to ask you, if you were one of those workers, would you have handed over ID just to end it? Or would you have held the line calmly like they did? Drop your answer in the comments. Share this with someone who works in a place where police roll through like this. And if you want more real-world accountability stories told clearly, like the video and subscribe.
Stand up. I need your ID.
What's the legal reason you need my ID?
There was a complaint. Do what I'm telling you.
A complaint about what crime?
Last time. Stand up and come outside with me.
My name is Malcolm Reed. I'm a federal judge.
That doesn't matter. Stand up.
The situation started inside a downtown cafe and ended in a federal case because everything was recorded. It began mid-conflict. A local police officer stood over a black man sitting alone, demanded identification, and told him to stand up. The man stayed seated, kept his hands visible, and asked the only questions that mattered: whether he was being detained and what the legal reason was. The officer didn't give a clear legal reason. He kept pressing like the demand was enough by itself. The room got quiet fast. People weren't even pretending it was normal anymore. Quick pause. Comment where you're watching from, country or state. And if you like stories where power gets checked by video, paperwork, and real consequences, hit like and subscribe. Now rewind to how it started. It was a weekday morning at Harbor and Stone, one of those downtown cafes that stayed busy from open to lunch. People came in for coffee, sat with laptops, took meetings in low voices. It wasn't chaotic, it was routine. The cafe had security cameras pointed at the entrance, counter, and seating area. The manager, Alyssa Park, liked clean operations and clean records. She ran the place like a system because that's how you avoid problems. Malcolm Reed walked in like a regular customer. Plain jacket, no suit, no badge, no sign of status. He ordered black coffee and sat near the window with a book. Nobody in the cafe knew he was a federal judge. He wasn't carrying himself like he wanted attention. He was off duty and staying off the radar on purpose. Outside, Officer Brent Kessler was working a downtown patrol shift, not an emergency response, not a call that required speed. It was the type of patrol where officers look for something. Stops, contacts, IDs, questions. Activity that looks good in numbers. Kessler entered the cafe with his body camera running. He didn't stop at the counter. He didn't ask staff if there was an issue. He scanned the room and walked straight to Reed. From the start, he approached like Reed was already a problem. He stood too close to the table and angled his body to control the space. Customers noticed because it wasn't a casual check-in. It looked like the beginning of a removal. Kessler told Reed there had been a complaint about a suspicious person sitting in the cafe. He demanded identification and acted like it was required. He didn't explain what crime was being investigated. He didn't give a description Reed supposedly matched. He used vague wording that gave him room to change his story later. Reed stayed calm and kept it simple. He didn't argue back and forth. He asked if he was being detained. He asked what the legal basis was for the ID demand. He asked if he was free to keep sitting there. Kessler didn't answer directly. He repeated the demand, then tightened his tone. The problem for Kessler was that Reed wasn't panicking and wasn't performing fear. He was responding like someone who knew the rules and needed the officer to state them. That alone made Kessler escalate. Alyssa, the manager, noticed immediately because she watched the room for trouble. She walked over and asked what was going on. She told Kessler the staff hadn't called on Reed. She also mentioned the cafe had security cameras. Kessler dismissed her and told her to step back. He treated it like the cafe was a stage he controlled, not a business he was entering. That changed the dynamic because now it wasn't just Reed and Kessler. Now there was staff, customers, and multiple recordings. Reed continued staying steady. He kept his hands visible. He stayed seated. He asked for the officer's name and badge number. He asked again if he was being detained and why. Kessler started building reasons on the fly. He implied Reed was not cooperating. He hinted that refusal itself was suspicious. He framed basic questions as attitude. He didn't lock into one clear justification because he didn't have one. Reed didn't reveal who he was. He didn't pull rank. He didn't try to embarrass the officer in front of the cafe. He let the officer talk and push because every extra step without legal cause made the record stronger. And that's why this incident didn't disappear like most do, because Kessler had a body camera running. The cafe had security footage from multiple angles, and Reed wasn't trying to win the moment. He was letting the officer create a trail. After Kessler planted himself at Reed's table, he stopped acting like he was checking on a complaint and started acting like he was running a removal. He kept ordering Reed to stand up and go outside with him. Reed stayed seated and kept the same calm pattern, hands visible, voice level, asking if he was being detained and what crime was being investigated. Kessler didn't lock into one reason. He stayed vague on purpose. He leaned on suspicious and treated Reed's questions like the problem. You could see it happening in real time. The officer wanted compliance first, and he was trying to invent a clean explanation after. Alyssa, the manager, came back over because it was obvious this was getting worse, not better. She told Kessler the staff hadn't requested police help and Reed wasn't causing an issue. She also pointed out the cafe had cameras. Kessler brushed her off and told her to back up. That wasn't a small detail. It showed he wasn't there to resolve something for the business. He was there to control Reed. Customers started paying closer attention. Not because Reed was loud, he wasn't. It was because Kessler was making it a scene. People recognized the pattern. Officer leaning in, demanding ID, pushing movement, then getting irritated when the person didn't fold. Kessler tried a new angle and acted like Reed had to step outside, right now. Reed didn't move. He asked whether it was an order and what authority it was under. That's when Kessler started talking like Reed was refusing lawful commands, even though he still hadn't stated a clear lawful basis for detaining him. Then Kessler made it personal in a coded way. He implied Reed didn't belong there and treated Reed's calm, informed responses as suspicious. It wasn't a slur, but it was the kind of line that tells everyone exactly what's driving the stop. Right after that, Kessler put hands on Reed. He grabbed Reed's wrist and tried to pull his arm back like he was moving into restraints. Reed didn't swing, shove, or jump up. He stayed controlled and didn't give Kessler anything that could later be labeled as aggression. He kept repeating the same questions and kept his posture steady. That moment was captured from 3 angles that mattered. Kessler's body camera, which recorded the officer's own words and shifting explanations. The cafe's security cameras, which showed the full scene and who was escalating. At least one customer recording quietly from nearby, which added an independent view in case anything went missing later. Alyssa stopped trying to debate Kessler and switched to documentation. She had staff call for a supervisor. She also pulled up the camera system at the counter and made sure the time window was locked in her head. She was already thinking about preserving video, even if she didn't say it like that. When Sergeant Holbrook arrived, the tone changed slightly, but not because the situation was suddenly legal. It changed because the department didn't want this getting worse in public. Kessler gave Holbrook a quick explanation that still didn't include a clear crime. He leaned on vague language and made Reed sound like the obstacle. Holbrook then spoke with Reed and got a short, factual account. Reed was sitting, Kessler demanded ID without stating a legal reason, and the interaction escalated when Reed asked basic detention questions. Holbrook tried to end it fast. She pushed for the easy outcome where Reed would just show ID and the officers could walk out, calling it a successful contact. Reed didn't take that exit. He stayed calm and kept the same line. He would follow lawful orders, but they needed to state the legal basis. Holbrook then tried another exit, asking Reed to leave the cafe to avoid further issues. Reed asked whether he was being ordered out and whether the business had asked for him to be removed. Alyssa answered clearly that Reed was welcome and not trespassed. That cut off one of the usual cover stories. At that point, Holbrook made the practical decision to stop the bleeding. She told Kessler to disengage. Kessler backed off, still acting like he was the one choosing to end it. Reed didn't argue, didn't lecture, didn't reveal who he was. He kept it procedural. He asked for names and badge numbers. He confirmed the body camera was recording. He asked how to request the incident report and related footage. Then Reed made the move that mattered most for what came later. He asked Alyssa in front of both officers to preserve the cafe's security footage from before Kessler entered until after he left, and to keep it secured. Alyssa agreed immediately. Kessler and Holbrook left. Reed stayed. He finished his coffee. Then he wrote down a clean timeline while it was still fresh. What Kessler claimed, what he demanded, how the reason kept shifting, when he put hands on Reed, and what the supervisor did when she arrived. Reed still didn't reveal his identity that day. He let the department think this would fade out like most complaints do, because the next part wasn't about the cafe anymore. It was about video reports and whether the officer's story could survive review. Reed didn't go online and rant. He didn't call a reporter. He handled it the way a case gets handled when you want consequences. The same day, he wrote down a clean timeline while it was fresh. When Kessler entered, what he claimed, when he demanded ID, when he tried to force Reed outside, when he put hands on him, and when Holbrook arrived and shut it down. Names, badge numbers, and the fact that multiple cameras captured it. Then he locked down the footage. He didn't rely on the police department to keep it safe. He worked directly with Alyssa. She exported the cafe video from multiple angles and saved it in more than one place. She also documented the time window and kept a basic record of who handled the file. Again, not dramatic, just enough that nobody could later say it was altered or not available. Reed also submitted formal preservation requests for the department side: body camera, dispatch logs, CAD notes, radio traffic, and the final report plus any edits. He did it in a way that created a paper trail. That matters because it prevents the usual excuse of, "It was overwritten," or "We didn't know you wanted it." About a week later, the department did what departments usually do first. They relied on the officer's written report. Kessler's report tried to make the stop look clean. It used broad language: suspicious behavior, refusal to identify, safety concerns, disturbance. It was written to justify everything after the fact. Then the video got pulled. Body camera showed the stop started with a demand for ID before Kessler could clearly explain a specific crime. It showed Kessler switching reasons as Reed kept asking the same basic legal questions. It also captured the coded line that revealed motive in the moment Kessler went hands-on. Then the cafe footage got compared to it. The cafe angle showed the whole room. Reed seated and calm, Kessler crowding him and raising the pressure, staff saying they hadn't called, and customers reacting only after Kessler escalated. The wide view also showed how Kessler tried to control the space and push Reed toward the door. Once you have that combo, body cam plus third-party security, there's no "he said, she said." It becomes sequence and proof. That's when this stopped being a normal internal complaint, because reviewers noticed something else. The paperwork started changing. A revised report version showed up with cleaner justification language than the first version. Small wording changes, but important ones. Written like someone realized video existed and tried to make the narrative match what the officer wished had happened. That raised a bigger question: who edited it, when, and why? And once that question exists, the review expands fast. Reed's identity still wasn't public, but the complaint landed where it mattered. Not because he was a judge, but because the evidence was strong and the handling looked suspicious. The case got referred beyond the local level. Federal civil rights investigators opened a review. They didn't start with politics, they started with patterns. They pulled Kessler's prior stops and checked for repeats. Stops based on vague, suspicious language. ID demands, without clear cause, stated reports describing non-compliance while video showed calm behavior. Repeated stops on the same type of people in the same areas. Similar wording across reports like it was copied and pasted. Then they widened to Kessler's unit. Same patterns showed up across multiple officers. Similar stop reasons, similar escalation points, similar report language. similar complaints that had been dismissed locally. The investigators also checked evidence handling and video integrity. They looked at upload times, access logs, missing segments, and whether footage was reviewed before reports were finalized. Because if a report is written like a script and the footage has gaps right where the script matters, that's not a mistake. That's misconduct. As the review widened, the local department tried to contain it. You always see the same move. Talk about training, talk about policy, talk about isolated incidents. But the federal team wasn't there for PR. They started interviewing people from previous stops. Some had never been believed. Some had taken pleas because fighting seemed impossible. Some had filed complaints and got ignored. Now investigators were matching their stories to video and paperwork. And once those cases got rechecked, the pattern became obvious. Stops without legal basis, pressure tactics, and reports written to justify whatever the officers decided to do. By the time subpoenas went out, Kessler's situation changed overnight. Now it wasn't a complaint. It was a federal inquiry with multiple incidents attached. And here's the key. At that stage, the worst thing an officer can do is try to fix evidence. Because the moment investigators see report manipulation, missing footage, or inconsistent file logs, it turns into criminal exposure, not just a policy violation. Kessler and his unit were now under that spotlight. Reed stayed quiet publicly and let the process work, because the story wasn't about one morning anymore. It was about how many mornings like that had been happening before anyone had the proof stacked this clean. Once the federal review widened past Reed's stop, the local department stopped treating it like a complaint and started treating it like damage control. Internal Affairs pulled Kessler off street work first. Then they suspended him. The unit he worked with got restricted too, because investigators weren't just looking at one incident anymore. They were looking at whether this was routine. Kessler tried to survive it the way people in that position often try, by sticking to the report and acting like the video could be explained away. But the problem was that there wasn't just one video. There was body camera footage showing shifting reasons and pressure tactics. There was cafe security footage showing the full scene and the fact Reed was calm and seated while Kessler escalated. There were witnesses. And then there was the paperwork trail, showing the report language changed after the fact. That last part is what turned a bad stop into criminal exposure. Because now the issue wasn't only the stop, it was the handling of evidence and official records. Federal prosecutors built the case around two big buckets. 1. Civil rights violations. They focused on unlawful detention and escalation without legal cause, and on using authority to pressure compliance without stating a valid basis. They treated Reed's case as the clearest example, but they didn't leave it at that. They connected it to other stops where the same patterns showed up. Vague suspicion, Idaho demands, escalating language, and then a report that turned it into non-compliance. 2. Evidence tampering, just falsification. This is where Kessler ran out of room. Investigators traced report edits, timing, and access. They compared report claims to what the video actually showed. They also looked at whether files were mishandled or whether details were added later to make actions look legal. At that point, the city's options narrowed. The department terminated Kessler. They tried to separate themselves from him publicly, but the federal case kept reaching back into the unit's history. People from older stops started getting calls. Some had cases reopened. Some had charges reviewed. Some had convictions questioned. Because if your stop practices are unconstitutional and your reporting is unreliable, the system can't pretend those cases are solid. When the case went to court, it wasn't presented as a viral moment. It was presented as a timeline. Here's what Kessler claimed. Here's what the camera captured. Here's what changed in the report. Here's the pattern across other stops. Here's what that pattern did to real people. Reed didn't center himself. He gave controlled testimony when required, stayed factual, and let the video do the work. The point wasn't that a judge was targeted. The point was that a citizen was targeted, and the only reason it couldn't be buried was because the citizen had the knowledge and discipline to document it correctly. The verdict and sentencing phase hit hard because it wasn't based on emotion. It was based on proof and repeat conduct. The judge in the criminal case treated it as a serious abuse of government power, not a bad day, not training issues, a willful pattern tied to falsified official actions. Kessler was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. That sentence became national news because it's rare to see that level of time given for this type of misconduct, especially when departments usually try to end these stories with resignations or quiet settlements. This one didn't end quietly because the evidence didn't leave room for a soft landing. Some cases connected to the unit were thrown out or reevaluated. Some people got their records corrected, some got settlements. The city paid, but the bigger cost was credibility. And Reed, he didn't do the victory lap. He went back to his life. And he kept the same approach that made the whole case possible. Calm, lawful, documented. He didn't win because he was powerful in the moment. He won because he refused to let power rewrite reality afterward. That's what made this a national example. Authority looks unstoppable when nobody checks it. It collapses when the facts are recorded, preserved, and reviewed by people who can't ignore them. Now, I want to ask you, if you were in that cafe, would you have recorded? Would you have spoken up as a witness? Or would you have stayed quiet and hoped it ended fast? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with someone who needs it. And if you want more real accountability stories told clearly like this, make sure you like and subscribe.
What's the reason for the stop?
I already told you, swerving, no signal.
That's not clear. I want a supervisor, please.
No supervisor's coming.
So you're refusing my request for a supervisor?
I'm the most senior officer out here.
Officer, this is escalating for no reason. I'm FBI.
Yeah, I'm sure you are.
So this traffic stop went bad fast. The patrol officer walked up to the driver's window and started giving commands immediately. He told the driver to open all the windows and stop using his phone. When the driver kept recording, the officer mocked him for it and called him a TikTok weirdo. The driver stayed calm and asked why he was being pulled over. The officer said he already explained it and accused the driver of swerving and failing to signal. The driver asked again because the explanation still wasn't clear, and then he requested a supervisor. The officer refused. He said no supervisor was coming and claimed he was the most senior officer on the road. Then he told the driver he could make his life difficult and said he enjoyed doing that. Quick pause. Where are you watching from? Drop your country or state in the comments. And if you watch these stories because you want to see people stay calm and protect themselves the right way, hit like and subscribe. Now rewind. The driver was Edward Reed, mid-30s, black, professional, and careful with his words. He worked federal law enforcement. He had been driving home in Florida after a long day, staying normal in traffic, not speeding, not acting reckless. When he noticed a patrol car behind him, he got even more careful. He signaled, stayed steady, and then the lights still came on. Edward pulled over cleanly, turned the car off, and kept his hands visible. He didn't start reaching for documents. He waited. He started recording because he wanted a full record of the stop. Officer Darren Klein approached with a hard tone from the start. He focused on control first, not explanation. He kept pushing Edward to stop recording and kept treating basic questions like disrespect. After the supervisor request, Klein escalated. He ordered Edward out of the car. Edward complied slowly and clearly, keeping his hands visible and following instructions. Klein then started a search. He moved through it like he expected to find something serious, not like a normal traffic stop. While searching, he kept pushing accusations, suggesting criminal activity, and questioning Edward's intent, even though Edward wasn't resisting and kept answering in a controlled way. Then Edward told the officer he had a firearm on him. That changed the stop immediately. Klein commanded Edward to raise his hands and treated the disclosure like a threat instead of a legal safety notice. Edward explained he was legally armed and had a Florida carry permit. Klein didn't accept that. He questioned whether the permit was real and kept pressing accusations like Edward was lying. During the search and detention, Edward finally identified himself as FBI and explained that his credentials were on him. Klein still didn't ease up. He said people pretend to be law enforcement and kept Edward detained while he continued checking and searching. Klein took the FBI's statement like it was another excuse. He kept Edward detained and kept control of the space while he demanded the credentials. Edward told him where they were and stayed still while Klein retrieved them. Klein checked the ID like he expected it to be fake, then stepped away to verify it through dispatch. Backup arrived while Klein was verifying. The second officer pulled in because of the weapon call and the way Klein had framed the stop. Edward stayed calm, hands visible, and didn't argue with the backup. He kept repeating the same points. He was legally armed, he disclosed it, and he was federal law enforcement. Dispatch confirmed the credentials. That's when Klein's tone changed, but not the attitude. He acknowledged Edward was FBI, then immediately complained that Edward should have said it earlier. Edward responded that he did try, but Klein kept cutting him off and kept escalating before he could get a full sentence out. Klein didn't address the earlier threats or the mocking. He shifted into excuses and warnings. He talked about people pretending to be law enforcement and tried to make the detention sound like normal caution. Then he started undoing the escalation. He told backup they were clear, canceled additional units that were still coming, and stopped treating it like a felony stop. He returned the credentials and moved back toward his cruiser. Edward asked if he was being cited or charged with anything. Klein didn't write a ticket. He didn't give a warning slip. He ended it with a vague statement about driving carefully and then told Edward he was free to go. Edward left without charges, but the stop didn't end clean. Klein looked angry walking away, like he'd been forced to back off, not like he'd realized he crossed a line. After Edward drove off, he didn't just forget it. He pulled into a nearby lot and documented everything while it was fresh. Time, location, unit info, what was said, and the order of events. He made sure his recording saved because he already knew how quickly stories get rewritten once reports start. Within an hour of getting home, Edward treated the stop like a formal incident, not a bad interaction. He didn't post it immediately. He didn't call friends to rant. He made copies of the video, saved it in 2 places, and wrote down a clean timeline. When the lights came on, when the officer started issuing commands, when the threats happened, when the search started, when he disclosed the firearm, when he said he was FBI, when dispatch confirmed it, and when he was released. The next morning, Edward did 3 practical things. First, he requested preservation of records. He wanted the officer's body cam, dash cam, dispatch audio, and any CAD notes locked in so nothing could be overwritten or missing. Second, he notified his chain of command, not in an emotional way, just facts. He explained that he was detained at gunpoint level intensity after a legal firearm disclosure, that the officer ignored identification until he felt like verifying it, and that threats were made during the stop. Third, he filed a complaint with the local department's internal affairs. He didn't write a long speech. He listed the statements, the actions, and the outcome. No citation, no charge, no clear basis for the search, and a stop that escalated after he requested a supervisor. Because of who Edward was, this didn't sit in a generic inbox. His supervisor took it seriously, not because Edward was important, but because the stop created risk. A local officer escalating like that against a compliant, legally armed person could get someone hurt, and the threats on camera weren't something a department could easily brush off if it got out. A few days later, Internal Affairs contacted Edward to confirm basic details and request his copy of the recording. Edward agreed, but only after he confirmed they were also preserving their own footage. He wasn't going to hand over the only clean record and hope the rest showed up. At the same time, the department pulled Klein's body cam and dash cam. They also pulled the radio traffic and the backup officer's footage. And when all of that got reviewed together, the pattern was hard to ignore. Klein escalated early over-recording. He made a direct threat about making Edward's life difficult. He refused a supervisor request while claiming nobody outranked him. He pushed criminal accusations without evidence. He treated a legal firearm disclosure like proof of wrongdoing. He doubted federal credentials even after Edward explained what he was and where the ID was. He ended the stop with no ticket and no charge. That last part mattered because it made the reason for the stop look weaker. Departments can defend a tough stop when it ends with a clear violation. It's harder when the officer found nothing and still went that far. Officer Perez also got interviewed because she was backup and she witnessed the later part. She didn't have to call Klein racist or abusive. She only had to confirm the basics. Edward was calm, compliant, and not acting like a threat. Not long after that, the department made quiet moves. Klein was pulled from road duty temporarily while the review continued. No public announcement, just schedule changes, different assignment, less time behind the wheel. Then Edward heard through official channels that the department was treating the complaint as sustained misconduct on at least some points. The biggest one was the threat. Saying you love making people's lives difficult isn't a tone issue. It's an abuse of authority statement, especially during a stop. The firearm part also became a focus. Florida has a lot of lawful carriers, and law enforcement training is supposed to cover safe handling of disclosures without turning every armed citizen into a criminal story. The footage showed Edward disclose calmly, and the escalation still happened. And while the investigation ran, the recording started to spread anyway. Not because Edward chased clout, because somebody always shares it. A clip got out showing the mocking about recording and the threat. It circulated fast because it was simple and clear. Officer mocks a driver for recording, then threatens him. Then later finds out he detained FBI. The department went into damage control mode, not panic, just the standard playbook. Say it's under review, say they take conduct seriously, avoid details, and wait for the storm to pass. But this one didn't fully pass because the evidence was too clean and the ending was too obvious. No charges. The department couldn't ignore it for long, not with internal affairs already involved, and a clip circulating that showed the threat and the attitude. Klein got called in for a formal interview, not a casual talk. A recorded statement with policies in front of him. They went through it in order: why he stopped the car, why he escalated over the phone recording, why he refused a supervisor request, why he threatened to make the driver's life difficult, why he searched, and why he kept pushing criminal accusations after finding nothing. Klein tried the usual defenses. He leaned on officer safety. He leaned on driver was argumentative. He leaned on I didn't know who he was. He leaned on people impersonate law enforcement. But none of those answers covered the threat. None of them explained the mocking. None of them explained why a traffic stop ended with no citation, but still turned into a detention with backup. And the recordings didn't match his tone on paper. Internal affairs didn't need to prove what was in his head. They only needed to document what he said and did. That's enough for policy violations. The outcome wasn't some movie ending. It was the kind of accountability that actually happens. Klein received discipline for conduct during the stop. The threat line became the center of it because it was clear and it was recorded. He was removed from solo road duty for a period and reassigned. Training and review were ordered, not optional. His stops and Bodycam usage were flagged for closer supervision for a while after. At the same time, the department made small policy adjustments that looked like training updates, but they were a response to this exact incident. Officers were reminded that civilians can record and that it's not a reason to escalate. Supervisors weren't allowed to be unavailable just because an officer didn't want oversight. Firearm disclosure procedures were emphasized again, especially in a state where legal carry is common. Edward didn't treat that as a victory parade. He treated it like a case closing. He kept everything: his recording, the timeline, the complaint number, and every email. He also made it clear through his chain of command that he wasn't asking for special treatment. He was asking for the same thing any driver should get: a lawful stop, clear communication, and no threats. The interagency part stayed tense. Klein didn't reach out to apologize. There wasn't any "we're all on the same team" moment. What Edward got was something more useful, a documented record that the stop was handled wrong and a change in how that officer was allowed to operate. And that mattered because it wasn't just about Edward. If Klein talked like that to a federal agent on camera, there was no reason to believe he was calmer with regular people who didn't have credentials or a chain of command behind them. That's why the paperwork mattered. That's why the recordings mattered. That's why Edward didn't let it end at "you're free to go." The last piece was what Edward did publicly. He didn't dump a full video online with a dramatic caption. He shared what needed to be shared when it made sense, and he kept it focused on conduct and procedure, not personal attacks, not internet revenge. The point was simple. Recording is protection, and threats from authority should never be treated as normal. So here's the question for you. If you were Edward, would you have kept recording and stayed calm the same way? Or would you have reacted differently when the officer started mocking and threatening you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more real modern stories where people hold their ground the right way, make sure you subscribe.
You got something in here you don't want me to see?
You're searching without consent. State your legal reason on camera.
All right. You're being detained.
Detained for what? You haven't stated a reason.
Shut up and turn around. Hands behind your back.
A traffic officer thought he could pull over a black man in a silver Mercedes, treat him like a criminal, search his car without consent, and then force an arrest when nothing turned up. What that officer didn't know was that the driver he was pushing around was an active senior deputy U.S. Marshal, and the entire stop was being recorded on Bodycam in a way that would be impossible to explain later. At this moment, we want to tell you that we're incredibly grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel alive and thriving. Now tell us where you're watching from, your state or country, in the comments. And if you like stories where people stay calm, keep their rights clear, and bad behavior gets real consequences, hit like and subscribe. Here's how it started. Malcolm Reed was driving home in a silver Mercedes. He was going the speed limit, staying in his lane, and using signals. It was early evening with steady traffic. The road ran past a shopping plaza and restaurants. A patrol car got behind him and stayed there for longer than normal. Malcolm noticed it but kept driving normally. He didn't speed up, slow down, or change lanes suddenly. Then the patrol car activated its lights. Malcolm signaled and pulled over to a safe spot on the shoulder. He shut off the engine, rolled the driver's window down, and kept both hands visible on the steering wheel. Officer Tyler Grady walked up to the driver's side. He did not clearly state why Malcolm was being stopped. He immediately focused on the vehicle and Malcolm's identity. He asked for license and registration in a hostile tone. Malcolm provided his license and registration. He asked for the reason for the stop. Grady did not give a clear reason. He kept asking questions about the Mercedes, including who it belonged to and how Malcolm got it. His questions implied he believed the car was stolen or that Malcolm was involved in something illegal. Malcolm stayed calm and kept his responses limited to what was required. He asked again for the reason for the stop. Grady escalated. He ordered Malcolm to step out of the vehicle. Malcolm complied. He exited slowly and kept his hands visible. He stood where Grady directed him. Grady immediately performed a pat-down. It was rough and aggressive. Malcolm did not resist. He stayed still and kept his voice controlled. Malcolm stated clearly that he did not consent to any search of the vehicle. Grady ignored that statement. He positioned Malcolm away from the Mercedes and moved towards the vehicle as if he was going to search anyway. Malcolm repeated that he did not consent. Grady proceeded as if the refusal didn't matter and prepared to search the car. Grady searched the Mercedes anyway, even after Malcolm clearly stated he did not consent. He started in the front cabin, moving fast, like he wanted it to look routine. He opened the center console and looked through it. He checked the glove compartment. He moved items around and looked into smaller compartments, not because he had a specific safety concern, but because he was trying to find something, anything, that would justify the way he had been speaking to Malcolm since the first seconds of the stop. Malcolm stayed where Grady placed him, several steps away from the vehicle, positioned so he couldn't interfere. Malcolm kept his hands visible and kept his posture calm. He did not move toward the car. He didn't raise his voice. He repeated one key point clearly so the camera would catch it. He did not consent to a search. Grady ignored that and kept going. He leaned into the passenger side area and checked places that didn't match any claimed reason for the stop. He looked under the front seats. He checked door pockets. He didn't find anything. And instead of stopping, he expanded the search. He opened the rear doors and searched the back seat area. He lifted floor mats and checked underneath. He looked between seat cushions. It wasn't a quick look for a weapon within reach. It was a search meant to produce a result. While he did it, Grady kept talking, trying to build a story out loud. He described Malcolm as nervous and not answering simple questions, even though Malcolm's behavior was controlled and his answers were basic. Grady kept implying there were signs without naming what they were. That's a common move when there's no real basis. Keep saying there's something, but never commit to a specific fact that can be disproven. Malcolm did not argue back and forth. He didn't get pulled into a debate. He stayed focused on clear, short statements, his lack of consent, his cooperation with commands, and his request for the reason for the stop. Grady still found nothing. No contraband, no weapon, no stolen property indicators, no baggies, no smell source, no open containers, no tools or items that could be claimed as burglary tools. Nothing. At that point, Grady had two options: end the stop and walk away, or double down and try to regain control. He doubled down. He shut the door and turned back toward Malcolm, changing his tone from searching to accusing. He told Malcolm he was being detained. Malcolm asked for the reason. Grady did not provide a clear reason. He circled back to the same vague insinuations he'd used from the beginning. Suspicion based on nothing concrete. Malcolm remained calm and asked again for the reason for the stop. He also stated again that he did not consent to the search that had just happened. Grady reacted like Malcolm's calmness was disrespect. That's when Grady escalated to physical control. He stepped into Malcolm's space, grabbed his arm, and moved to apply handcuffs. Malcolm did not pull away. He did not jerk. He did not tense up and give Grady a reason to claim resistance. He kept his hands positioned where Grady directed and allowed the cuffs to go on. But Malcolm made sure the record stayed clear. He said Grady was making a mistake and that his identity would be confirmed once his information was properly run. Grady acted like that didn't matter. He tightened the cuffs and continued treating it like a justified arrest. He walked Malcolm toward the patrol car, positioning him near the rear passenger side like he was about to place him inside. People were driving by. Some slowed down. A couple of heads turned from the sidewalk near the plaza entrance. Not a crowd, but enough visibility to make it humiliating and to make Grady feel like he had an audience. Then Grady finally did what he should have done at the start. He went to verify Malcolm's identity through dispatch. He radioed in Malcolm's name and information. His voice sounded confident, like he expected the system to back him up. Dispatch responded normally at first, then asked him to repeat the name and date of birth. Grady repeated it. There was a pause. Dispatch came back with a different tone, more formal, more careful. They informed him that Malcolm Reed returned as active law enforcement at the federal level, and that the record required additional confirmation. They instructed Grady to stand by. Grady tried to keep control of the scene, but the shift had already happened. He glanced at Malcolm, then away, as if he was recalculating. He started speaking faster on the radio, asking follow-up questions that sounded less like policing and more like damage control. Dispatch escalated it to a supervisor. Grady attempted to change his approach mid-stop. His posture softened slightly. His voice lowered. He stopped acting like Malcolm was a criminal suspect and started acting like this might become a problem for him personally. Malcolm didn't respond to the switch. He didn't argue. He didn't accept any "let's calm down" tone as if they were both equally responsible for what just happened. He stayed calm because he understood what mattered now: the footage, the sequence, and the lack of legal basis. Within minutes, Sergeant Dana Klein arrived. She didn't walk up like she was coming to support Grady emotionally. She walked up like she was there to take control of a situation that had already gone off track. She looked at Malcolm's cuffs first. Then she looked at Grady. Then she looked at the Mercedes. She asked Grady for the reason for the stop. Not the long version, not the opinion version, the actual reason. Grady tried to explain. It came out unclear and inconsistent. He referenced vague suspicion and tried to justify the search after the fact. Klein didn't argue with him on the shoulder. She did what competent supervisors do when they know something is wrong. She separated the officer from the driver and de-escalated immediately. She spoke directly to Malcolm in a professional tone and confirmed his identity through procedure. She had Malcolm uncuffed. She returned his license and registration. She kept the body cams running and made sure the stop ended without further escalation. Grady stood back, visibly frustrated, but he didn't have leverage anymore. The reason he didn't have leverage wasn't Malcolm's job title. It was the fact that Grady had created a stop with no solid justification, performed a search after non-consent, and then tried to turn the situation into an arrest when the search came up empty. Before Malcolm left, he made one clean statement to Klein that mattered. He didn't threaten. He didn't raise his voice. He made it clear that the footage would speak for itself and that the stop would be addressed through proper channels. Malcolm left the scene without raising his voice and without making it personal. He drove off, parked in a well-lit lot a few minutes away, and documented what mattered while it was fresh: the location, the approximate time, the sequence of events, and the key actions. No reason stated for the stop, rough pat-down, search after non-consent, cuffs with no evidence, and the name run that changed everything. He did not post online. He did not call friends to vent. He handled it like someone trained to build clean records. That night, Malcolm notified the right people through official channels. He reported that a local officer conducted an unlawful stop and search and attempted a baseless arrest while he was off duty. He included the officer's name and badge number, the patrol unit number if remembered, and the supervisor's name who responded. By the next morning, the department was already reacting. Because the moment a supervisor shows up to a stop involving an active federal law enforcement officer, the paperwork stops being optional. The stop gets logged, the body cam becomes evidence, and people above the patrol level start asking questions they can't ignore. Sergeant Dana Klein filed her own incident report. She included the basics. She responded to a traffic stop, verified the driver's identity, and terminated the detention. But she also had to account for why the stop escalated to cuffs and a search. That meant she had to document what Grady claimed and what he could actually support. And that's where Grady's story started collapsing. Grady wrote his version like most officers do when they know a review is coming. He tried to justify the stop with vague language. He described Malcolm as suspicious and implied there were indicators. He wrote that he felt officer safety concerns and suggested the search was necessary, but the body cam footage didn't match the report. A report can claim nervous behavior. The camera shows calm, compliant behavior. A report can claim refused to cooperate. The camera shows a driver providing license and registration and following commands. A report can claim probable cause. The camera shows no clear reason stated before the search, and a clear non-consent statement ignored. That gap is what turns a complaint into a case. Within days, Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation. They requested all recordings, Grady's body cam, Klein's body cam, any dash camera, and dispatch audio. They also pulled the CAD log to see the timeline, when the stop began, when the name was run, and exactly when the supervisor was called. They interviewed Grady first. That's standard. Give the officer a chance to explain before confronting him with the footage. Grady tried to keep his explanation broad. He said he believed the vehicle might be stolen. He said Malcolm's questions felt combative. He said he searched for safety reasons. He said the cuffs were to secure the scene. But IA doesn't build cases on feelings. They build them on policy and sequence. They asked him the simplest question. What traffic violation did he observe that justified the stop? Grady didn't have a clean answer. Then they asked the next one. What specific legal basis allowed him to search after the driver clearly stated he didn't consent? Grady tried to talk around it. Then they asked the one that ended his room to maneuver. Why did he try to arrest when the search found nothing? Grady had no good answer for that because the video showed it was about control, not evidence. At the same time, Malcolm filed a civil rights complaint through the process that actually moves things. Written statement, request for preservation of evidence, and a formal demand that the department retain all body cam and dispatch audio. He wasn't asking them to look into it. He was putting them on notice. He also retained counsel. The attorney didn't come in yelling. She came in methodical. She requested footage. She requested the officers stop history. She requested training records. She asked for prior complaints. She asked whether Grady had a pattern of stops that started as no reason stated and ended in searches. That's when the city's legal department got involved. Because this wasn't only a personnel problem, it was a liability problem. An unlawful stop, unlawful search, and false arrest exposure are exactly the kind of claims that cost departments real money, especially when video makes the timeline obvious. A few weeks later, the body cam footage was reviewed at a higher level. Not just IA, command staff, city attorneys, risk management, and the department could see it clearly. Grady's approach was wrong from the beginning. He escalated without facts. He ignored a clear statement of non-consent. He searched anyway. He found nothing. Then he tried to arrest anyway. That last part mattered the most. Searching with no basis is serious. Trying to arrest after the search fails is worse because it shows the goal wasn't safety or investigation. It was authority. Grady was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. His gun and badge were turned in. His patrol access was cut. His shifts were covered. It was quiet, but everyone in the building knew why. Then, the department tried the predictable internal move. Contain it. They reached out through official channels and floated the idea of resolving the situation quickly. Not an apology on the record. Not an admission of wrongdoing. More like an attempt to make it go away before it became public and before a lawsuit forced disclosures. Malcolm didn't take that route. He didn't want a quiet conversation. He wanted the record corrected and the behavior addressed. He understood what happens when incidents like this get handled quietly. The officer learns nothing. The department changes nothing. And the next driver doesn't have the same protection or documentation. So the case moved forward. A formal notice of claim was filed. The allegations were clear. Unlawful stop, unlawful search, unlawful detention, false arrest attempt, and excessive force during the pat-down and handcuffing. It wasn't written with dramatic language. It was written with timestamps. And that's what made it dangerous for the city, because the facts weren't complicated. The video made them simple. The city couldn't treat this like a normal complaint anymore. Malcolm's attorney had the body cam footage, the dispatch audio, and the supervisor response in writing. The timeline was clear. No stated reason for the stop. Immediate criminal assumptions, a rough pat-down, a search after Malcolm said he didn't consent, then cuffs and an arrest attempt after the search produced nothing. That combination forced the city into decision mode. They opened formal settlement discussions, while internal affairs finished their work. That's common in cases like this because the city doesn't want a jury watching body cam footage that makes the officer look reckless and the department look careless. Even if the city thinks it can defend parts of it, the risk is too high when the footage is straightforward. Internal Affairs completed its investigation and sustained multiple violations against Grady. The department didn't frame it as one mistake. They framed it as a pattern of bad judgment during a single encounter, initiating a stop without a clear, documented reason, escalating without evidence, conducting a search without valid consent or a legal exception, and applying cuffs without probable cause. That last point is what ended him. Because it wasn't just a bad stop. It was an attempted false arrest on camera. Grady was terminated. His termination letter cited policy violations related to traffic stops, search procedures, and arrest standards. He tried to appeal through the usual channels, but the body cam removed his ability to argue misunderstanding. The footage showed the sequence too clearly, and then came the certification issue. When an officer is fired for misconduct tied to unlawful actions, it doesn't just affect that department. It affects whether they can be hired anywhere else. Grady's file followed him. He could apply elsewhere, but departments that did their homework would see the same thing. He escalated a stop based on assumptions, then tried to arrest when he couldn't justify it. His law enforcement future collapsed fast. On the civil side, the case moved forward with pressure on the city. Malcolm's attorney filed in federal court under civil rights claims, including unlawful stop, unlawful search, unlawful detention, and false arrest. The filing was written like the video, clean and chronological. The city settled. They did it without admitting liability, because cities almost always try to avoid that language. But the settlement included real money, and it included non-monetary terms that mattered more long-term. The department agreed to changes tied directly to what happened to Malcolm. Supervisors required to respond sooner when a stop escalates to a search or cuffs without clear cause. Documented articulation required for traffic stops and searches, body cam compliance and regular audits, refresher training on consent searches and detention standards, and review of officers with repeated complaints involving stops that escalate without clear reasons. The department also had to preserve and produce footage faster under tighter rules, so footage couldn't disappear through delay or sloppy handling. Malcolm didn't celebrate publicly. He didn't do interviews to go viral. He didn't make it about status. He focused on the point that mattered. This happened because an officer decided his assumptions were enough to treat someone like a suspect. And Malcolm knew the only reason it didn't end worse is because he stayed calm, complied with lawful commands, and kept the record clear while the camera recorded the rest. Weeks later, Malcolm returned to normal life. Same kind of driving, same calm routine. But he also knew something important had shifted. The department had to put in writing what they were willing to tolerate. And Grady became an example inside that agency, not a hero, not a bad luck story, a warning. Because the system can ignore complaints when there's no proof. It can argue when there's no video. But when an officer's own camera shows an unlawful stop turning into a search, and then an arrest attempt with no cause, the excuses don't hold. So here's the takeaway for anyone watching. If you're ever in a situation like this, staying calm isn't weakness. It keeps you safe and keeps the story clear. Short statements matter. Consent matters. Asking for the reason matters. And cameras, body cams, dash cams, phones, business cameras, change outcomes because they stop people from rewriting what happened later. Now I want to ask you, if you were Malcolm, would you have stayed as calm as he did? Or would you have pushed back harder in the moment? And have you ever had a routine stop turn into something that felt personal? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, where people hold their ground and accountability catches up, make sure you like and subscribe.